to another episode of the Resinator's Conquest podcast. This episode, we're going to go over the charge action, one of my favorite actions. There are several basic steps in order to perform a charge action. First, the regiment would declare a charge. Then, take a measurement of the shortest distance between the charging regiment and the regiment that is to be charged. That is your charge distance. You'll roll a die and add that to your move characteristic of the regiment that is charging. And if that is equal to or greater than the charge distance, then you successfully made the charge. Otherwise, you failed the charge. You can find the rules on page 31, and it basically says that if the regiment fails the charge, they move straight forward without wielding the distance that you've rolled on the dice. And then that's the end of their movement. And if that was their first action, they will lose all other actions after that. The next step in a successful charge would be to align the charge. To align the charge, you're allowed to take a free 90-degree wheel to line up your regiment. After you have aligned the charge, you will then proceed to move your regiment forward until it contacts the enemy regiment. After you have contacted the enemy regiment, the next step would be to do a final last 90-degree wheel in order to connect to the enemy regiment. And the goal with this kind of snapping in or this last alignment is to gauge as many enemy stands as possible with your regiment. After this last alignment of kind of snapping into the enemy regiment, the last two things you're going to do is check and see if you have impact attacks on the regiment that is charging. In the examples that I'm going to show you in a little bit, they're going to be the Household Knight, which do have impact attacks. They also have brutal impact, which cuts the defense down of enemy regiments. But let's just stick with the impact attacks first. So if the regiment that is charging, that has successfully charged, has impact attacks, then they would roll those impact attacks now, using their base clash value. After the impact attacks, the last thing that basically happens is the regiment that is charged now is now inspired. So they'll get +1 to their clash for the next action that they can take if they have charged in their first action. Before we get into the examples, please make sure to go to Para-Bellum's website and download the rules. There, starting on page 31, you can start seeing the rules of charging. Now I'm going to show you some examples of how to charge. One last note before we get into the examples is this is all going to be Last Argument of King this episode. Alright, for our first example, we're going to show you here a basic charge. Now the Household Knights are going to be charging the Mori here. And we have a pretty straightforward charge. So in this case, we know that the regiment that the Household Knight want to charge with the Mori is going to be in their front arc. It's actually obviously right in front of them. And so now we need to just double check and make sure that's in the charge distance to make sure we can actually make the charge. So the Household Knight have an 8-inch movement. We'd roll a single die and add it to the movement characteristic of the Household Knight, which is going to be 8. So we roll a 4 plus 8 would be 12 inches. In this case, they'd be able to move all the way up because it's 11 inches to the target, and you would just slide them forward. And then they'd be engaged with the Mori right here. Here's our second scenario where you have your Household Knight facing in a direction that's not quite straight on to the Mori that they want to charge. So in this case, you have to make sure that the Mori are in the front arc of the Household Knights. And the easiest way to do that is to hold the tape measure in between diagonal angles, diagonal corners of the stand, and then you can see that's the front arc, basically. That kind of V. So that would be from here to here is the front arc. And as you can see, they're in the front arc of every single one of the stands in the regiment. So they can legally charge the Mori. Then you would measure the distance between the closest point of the charging stand to the closest point of the regiment to be charged. The Mori are at 11 inches away, okay? So now you'd have to roll your dice. and you get the 6 on top of the 8-inch movement, so you got a 14-inch movement. Now the first thing that the knights are going to have to do in order to charge the Mori are going to make a free 90-degree wheel to align the charge going forward. Now this does not include the movement, so we already know we made the movement of the charge. So all we're going to do now is move the tape measure out of the way. What you're going to do is wield your household knight up to 90 degrees so that they're facing the Mori. Then they would charge straight in. And that would be that 14-inch charge based on the 6 rolled. Right now we have scenario 3. And in this case we have a piece of terrain that's going to be in the way of blocking the household knight from being able to fit in here. And you'll see what I mean here when I use this stand here. If I put this stand right here, it'd be resting on the terrain, and it can't actually rest on that terrain. In this scenario, the household knight have the Mori in their front arc, and they're 11 inches away. Alright, so we're going to roll our dice, and that would be a failed charge, so they would only move forward 2 inches. But in this case, we're going to re-roll, because let's just say they had unstoppable. So let's just say they get to re-roll, and this time they rolled a 3, so on top of that, that would be 11 inches. That would get them all the way to here. So the first thing that they would do, again, is wield up to 90 degrees in order to kind of align the charge. Then they'd move forward 11 inches. Alright? And now because they can't wield past this unit will actually, the Mori regiment will actually wield into the household knight, and there they would now be both engaged. Now we have a scenario where the household knight want to charge the Mori. As we can see, the household knight have the Mori in their front arc. Now let's measure the charge distance needed to make a successful charge. And it looks like it's going to be about 11 inches. Alright, so we have a die roll. Let's get a die. Where's my dice? The household knight have a move distance of 8. So we're going to add the die roll. Now this is a perfect example of if they miss the charge, they would only move forward 2 inches. So you just measure out your 2 inches, they kind of just stumble forward. Okay, so now let's say they rolled a 4. That would give them a 12-inch charge distance. So that would definitely make it, because that was 11 inches. The first thing they'll do is have a free 90-degree wield in order to align the charge. Then they'll charge forward. And then the last thing they can do is do another 90-degree wield in order to snap into base contact with the enemy regiment. And in this case, you're going to want to snap into here, the side flank of the Mori, and then you just kind of snap into there. Here's another example of a charge scenario, and you can find this charge scenario on page 34 of the rules. This is where if you have a friendly regiment in blocking a regiment that wants to charge. So my household knight want to charge through the Steel Legion in order to get to the Mori, and they can do that as long as they can clear the distance between the two with either a single action, like let's say right now a charge. So if you want to do a charge, you'd measure your charge distance, and right here we'd be about 11 inches. And so that in this case, let's see this down. It'd be 11 inches. And so in this case, you'd have to roll a 3 or better. In this case, it'd be a 6. And you can just move your guys around and charge them in, and they'd be engaged with the Mori. Now, let's just say they were farther back. Now, if they're either here 14 or 15 inches, this would be outside a single charge. So in this case, they would have to take both of their actions, a move action first, that would move them up 8 inches, or let's see, 8 inches, so it would be to here, and then they could make the charge the last 7 inches, and they would make it into engagement with the Mori again. And so in that case, you just move them again all the way forward. In this case, they'd be taking the 2 actions, the move and the charge. And it'd be an automatic charge because it's underneath their movement characteristic. Okay? Now, there is a scenario that if for some reason they couldn't make the distance, you would put the charging regiment back to its legal position, and then both regiments would be broken. Those were some examples of charging and how to align charges and make charges and charging through other friendly regiments. Now I'm just going to give you some of my experience in charging because I really liked using the Household Knights when I first started playing Conquest. I played really heavily into my 100 Kingdoms, and I definitely am still trying to get some Crimson Tower in order to make my whole all cavalry 100 Kingdom army. So the first thing is be aware of where your charging regiments are compared to impassable terrain or like hindering terrain or water or wherever they're going to lose their impact attacks. Because like let's just say for example my Household Knight, they're really good at the impact attacks and they're devastating when they hit them, but once they get into melee, they're really not great at mopping up. So you really want to get the enemy regiment pretty much wiped out in that charge. So you can't be going through terrain that's going to stop the impacts from happening. The other thing I was doing early on that was kind of a mistake is I was trying to wait for the perfect opportunity to make a good charge. And sometimes I would maneuver my guys behind some terrain to kind of like, bring them out as a surprise, and then realized now I have to make all these awkward movements to get them away from the terrain and then make the charge. So be aware of that. The other thing that I've had an issue with early on is being a little unlucky to where I moved close enough to where now this next turn I can make a charge. But that also meant that the enemy sometimes could move and then charge me, and then that would prevent me from making the charge. And so what I started to do is really protect my charging units with a unit of like maybe infantry in front of them in those scenarios, so that if I didn't win the initiative in that next round, that my Household Knight were now behind an infantry unit that could take the brunt of a charge. And then, now obviously the Household Knight or that charging unit is going to be kind of stuck behind this melee. But if your infantry unit, like in the case of my example of the Steel Legion, if they can mop up that unit that charged them, then the Household Knight can just kind of pass them up and go somewhere else. Or maybe they just kind of reform and go a different direction. So pay attention to the counter charge. Oh, another thing is, so monsters bases, they're kind of an awkward size, and so the way that I have been instructed and told that we're supposed to be doing it is, in order to maximize the amount of stands that are in contact with a monster regiment, you wouldn't really align them squarely. You would align it so that the monster regiment or the monster stand is connected up to 3 of the enemy regiment stands. And that would be maximizing their monster stance in engagement when they're charging. So just be aware of that, because it's when I first wanted to start doing was aligning it just like you align all the other charges stands, square base to square base, But it's in monsters, it's a little kind of a different situation. So be aware of that for monsters. Just like in the move action, when the regiment would finally be kind of snapped into place, if they can't fit there, they can't make that charge. So there's some times where an enemy regiment is like too close to your friendly regiment and you can't fit in between there, a stand in between there, or 2 stands. Let's just say your charging regiment is 2 stands thick and there's only room for 1 stand in between your friendly regiment and the enemy regiment that you're trying to charge. They wouldn't be able to fit into that area, so they wouldn't be able to make that charge. You had to probably like reform first and then try a charge, or move the friendly regiment that's in the way. Same goes for terrain. So that could be a way of preventing someone from charging you, is to make sure you're kind of tied up close behind some terrain or impassable terrain. In some cases, there's an automatic charge, like your distance that your charge distance is equal to or shorter than your move characteristic, and in that case you just automatically charge, and in the last argument you're just going to go in there and snap in like you would normally do on a successful charge. One last kind of a bit of advice that I have is I've seen people not do this, is that you have a charging unit like the Household Knight. And now let's say they're mopping up an enemy regiment, and they have like, the enemy regiment has maybe 2 hit points left on a stand, okay? And you have like a full 6 Household Knights, you know? And you know that they're gonna wreck them if you do an Inspire action first and then a Clash action. Why not do a Clash action first, you know, and have a little bit lower Clash characteristic, but you know, you have a lot of hits that you're rolling, or a lot of dice that you're rolling in order to get hits, and you only need 2 wounds in order to, you know, successfully kill that regiment. Now the Household Knight have a second action, and they can charge a different regiment, and they have an 8-inch movement, so that means they have a total of 14 inches they can charge, because that would be a die roll of a 6. And there's other benefits that you can give them in order to either, you know, make them re-roll or have longer charge distances or stuff like that. So be really aware of that, and be really aware of like the fact that you can take a Clash action first and then charge. You don't always have to take an Inspire and then Clash. You could save that Inspiration action and use that as a charge action as your second action. So yeah, try to do that. Try doing that. I think you'll be happy with the results, because it's happened to me a couple times where I was able to mop up, you know, just roll my normal Clash action and then charge another regiment and almost completely wipe it out on those impact attacks with the brutal impact that they have. Alright, that's all for this episode. The next episode, we're going to focus on the charge action in First Blood.